"Janie, honey," my mother said as we left the funeral, "that lawyer gave me a key." "A key?" I said. "It seems that Aunt Tabitha left you something, locked in a safety deposit box." "Really?" I asked, turning to my mother. "But wasn't she poor?" "In the end, yes. I'm honestly surprised she still had a bank account." "But why would she give me something? I barely knew her." "Well, you were the closest thing she had to a child. But your guess is as good as mine." "What do you think it is?" "I haven't the slightest clue, but I think we should go find out." We went straight from the funeral to the bank, and to my mother's surprise, Aunt Tabitha did indeed have a safety deposit box. A bank teller walked us back to a private room and placed the box on the table. It was small and couldn't hold much, but it was real. And it was mine. The size did little to subdue my fantasies of finding something valuable inside. My mother's eyes were wide with anticipation, also secretly hoping for something good. We were not well off, and the thought anything valuable was an exciting prospect. "Open it," my mother said, handing me the key. "Okay, here goes." I twisted the brass key and the tumblers clicked. I was more excited than I was letting on. Would there be some precious heirloom inside? Or maybe some old coin collection? My hands shook as I opened the lid. Inside were two things: a large snow globe and a folded piece of paper. I pulled the items out and sighed. "I guess finding stacks of $100 bills was a bit of a stretch," my mother said with a chuckle. I laughed briefly before pulling the snow globe from the metal container. It was fairly large and surprisingly heavy. The base was wooden, decorated with intricate hand-carved designs. The glass ball was crudely painted in thick black acrylic. Only through some of the flaked-off paint could you see anything inside. "I wonder how old this is," my mother asked, gently running her fingers along the carved base. I did not answer. Instead, I set the snow globe down and grabbed the folded sheet of paper. On it was my name. "Dear Janie, I have left you my prized possession. Please treat them better than I did. Their world is our world. Sincerely, Aunt Tabitha." "What the hell does this mean?" I said, showing the note to my mother. "I don't know. Tabitha was a very sick woman. Something happened to her years ago during a trip to Guatemala that changed her forever. The once kind and outgoing woman was transformed in a reclusive and angry witch of a sister. I don't know what happened out there, but she was never the same. It got really bad the last couple years. Last I heard, she spent her life savings chasing something out in the Pacific Ocean. Who knows what was going through her mind? What was she looking for? I'm not sure exactly, but she would often ramble about learning the truth, whatever that meant." "Was she crazy?" "Crazy enough. Now, let's get home. I'm exhausted." I took the globe home and stashed it inside an old box in the garage, not thinking much about it until weeks later while cleaning up my room. I had just reorganized my bookshelf, which freed up some space. It seemed like a perfect place for my late aunt's prized possession. I went to the garage and pulled it from the box. As I passed it between my hands, I was once again surprised by how heavy it was. It was quite beautiful, except for the globe portion, which had been covered over with cheap black paint. It took me close to an hour of scrubbing and scraping until the interior of the globe was finally revealed. It was underwhelming, to say the least. Inside was a townscape, resting atop a rocky island, rising from choppy seas. The town structures were so small that there was little to see with the naked eye. It was rather plain, and I even contemplated taking the globe back to the garage. However, I figured I should display it for a little while at least, in my late aunt's memory. While positioning the globe on the shelf, I realized that I had yet to shake it, and what good is a snow globe without watching the snow fall? I took it into my hands and shook a few times. When I looked inside, I realized why my aunt considered this her prized possession. Crystalline snowflakes flustered around inside the globe, glittering like diamonds in the afternoon sun. It was beautiful, and to my amazement, it looked just like real snow. A powerful illusion, to be sure. After watching the snow settle over the town, covering the streets in delicate white powder, I was proud to put it on my shelf. I gave it one last good shake before putting it into its spot on the shelf. It wasn't until after midnight that I looked at it again. Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds played in the background while I needlessly checked my phone. Each time was no different. There were no new messages. Not like I expected anything different. I had no friends, and my mother was out with her latest boyfriend, some loser she met online. She wouldn't be home until morning. So it would be another Friday night alone, doing homework and watching scary movies until I passed out from boredom. I began to fall asleep as the movie ended. In the darkness, just as my eyes were closing, something caught my attention. Upon my bookshelf was a dull, flickering light, emanating from my aunt's snow globe. I forced myself from bed and staggered over to take a closer look. What I found was far stranger than any old Hitchcock movie. Inside the globe were dozens of microscopic pinpoints of light scattered around the island. It was hard to tell at first, but after watching closely, I was certain they were moving. What the hell, I thought, slowly stroking my chin. I needed a magnifying glass. There was one in the basement inside an old science kit I got in 3rd grade. It wasn't great, but it would have to do. I placed the magnifying glass over the globe, focusing in on one of the luminous specks. I gasped out loud and reeled backwards, dropping the magnifying glass to the floor. It shattered on impact. I stumbled, shocked and confused, my bare foot stepping on broken glass. There was no pain as it pierced my skin, but I still screamed. I sat on my bed, breathing heavily, my foot wrapped up in an old t-shirt. It was bleeding badly, but my focus was directed at the snow globe. Remember how I told you the town had little to no detail? Well, everything was much different on the magnification. That was when I first saw them. The Littles, as I call them now. I only caught a quick glimpse of one, or rather, 2 of them. They were outside in a large open field, which was covered in a blanket of snow. One Little was standing up, holding a torch in its hands. It was leaning over a second Little, who was sprawled out, half buried in snow. They looked human, but I couldn't be sure. I only saw them for a second. It took me some time to muster the courage to peek inside again. I'd convinced myself it was just my imagination or some strange dream. But when I approached, neither was the case. You could not see much with the naked eye, but it was there. Tiny lights were moving around inside the dome. I needed another magnifying glass. That night, I raced out to Walmart and bought the biggest, best magnifying glass I could find. From that day forward, my obsession with watching the littles began. Under high magnification, the globe's interior was transformed into something magical, a priceless treasure. I imagined wars would be fought over such a thing, and it was all mine. Inside the sphere of glass was a small city, containing a miniature world, teeming, full of life. It was reminiscent of Edinburgh in the early 19th century, sitting atop an island, with rocky cliff coasts ripped straight from a Scottish travel brochure. The town crawled up the island's western slope, where communities of sparsely packed cottages encompassed the lower elevations. These communities were broken up by large areas of open space, filled with various livestock pastures and farmland. As you moved higher in elevation, the town became more urban, where tightly packed multi-story stone buildings lined the snow-covered cobblestone roads. At the city's highest point was the downtown district. It was the cleanest and most exclusive area in the city, filled with a vibrant nightlife. Along its gas lamp-lit roads were fancy restaurants, shops, numerous entertainment venues, and stunning government buildings. At the apex of the island was a plateau, the location of a long-since destroyed castle. Only a faint trace of its foundation was still standing. In its place was an overgrown garden, filled with numerous statues and monuments. Only the faint shape of breasts carved in stone made it clear that this must have been a woman. Behind the plateau, on the eastern slope of the island, was a dense forest that covered everything down to the sea. For all its beauty, the city was not the most impressive thing inside the globe. That honor went to the people inside. They were magical to watch, hundreds of little beings moving and flowing within confines of a glass dome. They looked just like us, only microscopic, each the size of a grain of sand, living a life inside their insular world. The night I first discovered them was incredibly difficult. Something horrendous had happened to their population. Scattered around the island were dozens of dead littles, littering the snow-covered streets. 42 men, women, and children were dead. I stayed up the entire night watching them gather bodies and transporting them to their final resting place. At the coast, nestled up against the rocky cliffs, was their cemetery. A massive plot of land with thousands of tombstones jutting from the soil. It took a coordinated effort, but by dawn, they had buried all their dead. Many tears were shed that night. It was a tragedy. I couldn't help but cry along with them. Over the next few days, I spent almost every waking minute watching them. The only time I left the bedroom was to feed myself and occasionally use the bathroom. My normally organized room had begun to deteriorate. Cleaning had taken a back seat to the drama which unfolded every day inside the globe. The littles were busy things, racing around their little world in much the same way we do. Morning would come and the city would come alive. The children, dressed in their little uniforms, would be ushered to school by their hard-working mothers, who then would return their babies and household duties. The men embarked to various jobs, some to the urban areas, others tending the farmland. There was even a crew who ploughed all the snow that had previously covered the streets and sidewalks. Transportation by horseback was the most common method of travel for most residents, with the exception of the wealthy. They rode exclusively in horse-drawn carriages, amazingly detailed and driven by servants. It was fascinating. I had a miniature world at my fingertips, full of miniature men, women and children. Along with numerous animals, they were all living their life inside a snow globe, seemingly oblivious to the outside world. The entire island was utilized and worked on a daily basis. The garden atop the plateau was the exception. Nobody stepped foot on its grounds. My first thought was it had to be some kind of sacred place. The numerous sculptures, altars and monuments had a religious look to them. At the epicenter was that large statue of a woman, rising taller than any of the other structures on the island. The arms were broken off, and at the base was her head, smashed into pieces. Graffiti covered every inch of the stone, which was unusual for an otherwise clean city. I often wondered then if they could see me, a perceived giant glaring down on them from above, watching their every move. But so far, I had seen no indication they had felt my presence. Weeks passed, and my obsession continued to grow. It became so enticing to watch that I'd been skipping school and lying to my mother about it. She didn't catch on. Her energy was focused on spending time at her new boyfriend's house. I was left to fend for myself as usual. But with my new pets, I had pretty much forgotten about her absence. It was better this way. I didn't want her interfering with my new hobby. It wasn't long before I could recognize most of the littles, even going so far as to give them all names. I knew their spouses and children, where they worked, and even what restaurant they ate at on Friday nights. But best of all was learning their juicy little secrets, watching as they engaged in activities they did when they thought no one else was watching. Over time, I found their lives were not much different from our own. There were rich and poor, beautiful and ugly, good and bad. On its surface, the city appeared to be a utopia, filled with happy little people living their perfect lives, immune to the outside problems of our world. But underneath that facade was a darker side, festering in the depths of the night. It became obvious on the night Ayme witnessed a murder. A young woman I called Pauline was walking alone at night after a night of drinking. She had left an exclusive downtown lounge, stumbling home under the soft glow of the gas lamps. She wore a long lavender gown cinched tightly at her waist, rising up to a low-cut bodice that gave all who stared a splendid view of her ample bottom. So oblivious to her surroundings that the young woman did not notice the man hiding in a dark alley, waiting for an opportunity. While passing the alley, the man reached out and grabbed Pauline. She tried to scream, but the man covered her mouth before she could react. Seconds later, she was pulled back into the cover of darkness. I couldn't see what happened next, but 20 minutes later, he emerged alone and walked home. It was Fjorgen, one of the woodcutters. The constables pulled her out in a body bag the next day. It was that moment that I decided things must change. Inside, living among my people, were sickos and perverts who tainted the purity of my utopia. It must come to an end. I couldn't change my world, but I could change theirs. I needed to communicate. At first, I tried signaling them with my lights, flipping it on and off sporadically. While this seemed to annoy them at times, they paid little mind and went along with their daily routines. I did not know how old the globe was, but certainly sudden changes in light must have been a common occurrence. I tried loud music, but sound did not work either. Either they could not hear, or they were ignoring it. Tapping the glass accomplished nothing. I even gently shook the globe, sending a fresh coat of snow over the town. But the next day, they just removed all the snow from their streets and continued on as usual. Luckily, it wasn't long until I got their attention. Using a small piece of paper, I printed the phrase, "I can see you," in bold black lettering. I waited until Saturday, when everybody was gathered at the soccer field, the afternoon games. I pressed the slip of paper onto the glass and waited. Eventually, one of them saw the message. Its discovery spread through the crowd like wildfire, and soon all were staring towards the sky, reading my words. I watched as the throngs of people went to their knees in unison and raised their hands to the sky. A group of men rose to their feet and started collecting stones, which they placed together to form large letters. They were communicating. "Praise you, God," was spelled out in giant stone letters. Did they think of me as a god? It made perfect sense. If they knew nothing of the outside world, then obviously seeing words in the sky would point to a higher power. To them, I must be a god, and in a way I was. Their fate was in my hands. It was then that I decided they would love me. Over the next few days, we developed and refined a workable communication system. I would type out my demands on paper, much smaller now, so only a select few could see it. I designated 2 men and a woman as priests, whose duty it was to relay my messages to the people. From that moment forward, they became my children. I was good to them. I ensured a consistent day and night cycle, providing their crops ideal conditions for growth. Every 3 days, I would gently shake the globe at a prearranged time. Apparently, snow coverage was very important for the vitality of the environment. I had to be careful though. If I shook too hard, it would be disastrous for the city. Too much force would send the people flying, killing or wounding any who were unlucky enough to find themselves in the wrong place. I took good care of them, like a good mother. In return, all they had to do was obey my simple rules of law. They worshipped me. A mob even went to the garden, the first I had seen enter it, and tore down the woman's statue. It was replaced with one twice the size, likened in my image. It took them weeks to carve, and when finished, it was nothing short of magnificent. Many would pray at my stone feet, praising their one and only master. I was a benevolent god, unlike their previous master who treated them so poorly. They told of my aunt, the ruthless god who had subjected them to a year of darkness. Many perished from starvation over that year, with no new crop growth. I promised that nothing like this would happen. There would be peace and plenty under my rule. As the weeks passed, my obsession changed. I slowly shifted away from observing them for pleasure to reasons of much more importance. I began to monitor them ever so closely, watching for any lawbreakers disobeying rules. Many did. I watched men sneak out and cheat on their loving wives, fucking dirty whores when they thought no one was watching. Their sins did not go unnoticed. I, the all-seeing, witnessed everything. The women were no better, spreading their legs for any man with a large wallet or a handsome face. Disgusting. Along with deviant fornication, excessive drinking had become rampant in the city. The alcohol consumption led to a massive crime wave throughout the city, and I would have to stop it. This led to my first major edict: full prohibition. Tolerating bad behavior had come to an end. So I watched them, day and night, documenting every infraction they committed. Their offences were passed along to the priests, who sent my enforcement team out to make arrests. I was the judge and jury, the final arbiter of justice. If you broke one of my laws, you were subject to punishment, and if the offence was especially heinous, I had them executed. Crime would not be permitted. The globe had to be cleansed of sin. I found the public executions in the town square worked the best. After a few of those, the little shaped up quickly. Crime had dropped through the city. There had not been a notable offence in days. I was doing a wonderful job. All was well until I happened to peer into a window that was slightly obscured by drapes. This was a major infraction in itself. By law, all windows covering must remain open, day or night. I zeroed in on the house, watching closely and waiting. The front door opened. Out came a young man, jerking his head around, searching for anyone watching him. He was not Clementine's husband, who was working a shift in the wheat fields. No, the man leaving was Tanith, the baker's son, a boy no older than 20. What was a strange man doing in Clementine's home when she should be caring for a new baby? I watched him cinch his belt as he left, giving me all the evidence I needed. They would not get away with this. I was furious. I contacted the police and ordered both of the adulators dead. I had to make an example. They would be beheaded tomorrow at noon at the base of my statue. The filthy whore and her young lover wept as they waited, heads secured onto stone altars. I watched lustfully. The anticipation was the best part. The executioner took his axe and approached the two altars, mouthing my warnings to the crowd. Every man, woman and child were there to witness the punishment. This had better teach them a very important lesson, or things would get much worse. The axe was raised above the head of the condemned, but the killing blow never came. Instead, the executioner turned his back and faced my statue. He gripped the handle in both hands, pulled it back, and whipped the axe end over end toward the statue. The hammer side connected with the left shoulder, cracking the stone. As the arm crashed down onto the garden floor, the crowd went wild in celebration. I watched, jaw hanging open, stunned by their blatant disobedience. After all I had done for them, this is how they repay me? In a rage, I grabbed the globe in both hands and shook, shaking it as hard as I could, screaming with each motion. The snow inside was streaming in a vicious blizzard as I slammed it down on my desk, the heavy impact knocking a mountain of trash to the floor. I waited, breathing heavily for the snow to settle. When it finished, all I could do was smile. There were bodies everywhere, scattered, bloody, lifeless. Men, women, children, no group was spared from my wrath. The night when I first discovered them, caring for their dead, I cried. This day was much different. They had blatantly disobeyed me and had to be punished accordingly. Hopefully the survivors would think twice before disobeying their god again. It was so simple. Obey my will and be rewarded with life and prosperity. What was so broken in their little minds to do such horrible things? They were cheaters and liars. This was their last chance. It took weeks for the survivors to clear and bury the hundreds of bodies. I'd be lying if I told you the cemetery did not look very different after that. New headstones were everywhere, and each one a distinct reminder of their sin. It was they who caused their fate, not I. I made it very clear that derelict behavior would not be tolerated. If anyone disobeyed me again, I would not be so merciful a second time. Life was much different from then on. The benevolent ruler was dead. Their first task was erecting a statue, 3 times the size of the one they ruined. Every citizen was required to pray at its feet 3 times a day. I required half their crops destroyed at every harvest, burned as an offering to my greatness. All excesses were terminated, and a strict curfew was enacted. There would be no flirting, courting, or relationships unless I approved. Sex would be strictly regulated for procreation purposes. This was their life, a life free of sin. My heavy hand worked flawlessly. They all behaved as model citizens, removing all problems virtually overnight. There were a few executions at first, But it wasn't long until they obeyed my every order. Peace had been achieved. Unfortunately, there was an unintended side effect of their unquestioning obedience. It became boring. Everything was the same day after day, no sex, lies, fights, or anything else to give me a reason for a good beating or execution. My interest in them softened. They were like robots, drained of humanity. But there was something else going on, buried deep beneath the surface of their smiling faces. They were all lying to me. I was sure of it. Oh, how they wanted to sin every inch of their bodies, aching to partake in the pleasures of the flesh. But the fear restrained them. They were afraid. That's all. It was hopeless. The Lils could not be cleansed. It was obvious by this point, and after everything I had done for them, rescuing them from that cold metal box, sustaining their crops, removing all sin from the world, and this is what they think of me. I bet they cursed me inside their tiny heads, the one place I could not watch. I hated them. I hated their worthless little lives. I took the heavy globe, gripping it tightly in my right hand, cursing all those inside it. The ungrateful little shits! I would show them what happens when you anger a god. I swung my hand forward, launching the globe towards my bedroom door. The glass collided with the oak frame and shattered into 1,000 pieces, their world destroyed. I rushed over and scanned the carnage with my eyepiece. This was their end, an end I savoured, witnessing the last seconds of their miserable lives. Oh, I could finally hear them, ever so faintly. But it was there. 1,000 people screaming in unison, taking their final breaths, punished by a vengeful god. My aunt had been much too merciful putting them in that box. At that moment, I thought of her, and the note she had left in the box. I recited the words. I have left you my prized possession. Please treat them better than I did. Their world is our world. Their world is our world. That line repeated in my head over and over again. I remembered something my mother had said just as we were opening the safety deposit box. Aunt Tabitha had been searching for something in her last days, way out in the Pacific Ocean. What could she have been looking for? My mind raced, imagining my own existence. If a tiny civilization of people could live inside a snow globe, then what was our world? Are we inside an even bigger globe, monitored by some being who at any second night might smash our worlds against their bedroom wall? It was an unpleasant thought. I needed some air. As I stepped towards my open window, the floor began to shake. An earthquake in Oklahoma? It had been years since the last one. I knew what to do. We all do. I grabbed the window frame and held on tight, calmly gazing out the window. The world around me shook in slow and steady waves. People who were walking along the streets with nothing to grab fell to the ground. Certainly there would be some injuries, but no fatalities. This was a mild quake. Nothing like some of the monsters I survived as a child. When it all stopped, I took a deep breath and looked at the sky. Seconds later, the snow began to fall.